I think we are going live. Yes, we are. We're live with Richard. Let me just tweet that, and then we can get going. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to have you here. I guess we'll be live just 20 minutes to catch up and chat a bit about what's been happening the past weeks in the world of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Treasury Companies. But yeah, Richard, maybe you want to briefly introduce yourself, and then we can just
Sure,
chat about whatever we feel like.
sure. So I've been in Bitcoin since 2017. Most recently launched a Bitcoin denominated fund of crypto hedge funds to achieve yield in the Bitcoin space, targeting 3 to 8%. We'll be rebuilding that in the next few months and plan to launch that in partnership with another investment manager. So my sort of participation in the Bitcoin Treasury space is really just as a commentator. I did get involved in trying to launch a Swiss one, which we ended up selling to H100 beginning of this year, because it just proved a little bit painful for a company with no track record to do this. So H100 have the adequate amount of track record to be able to do this in Switzerland. And so I've since stepped back from H100 to focus on what I'm doing at Bees Partners, which is what I mentioned before, just focused in the yield space in Bitcoin, which I think is a very important tool, not just for any Bitcoiner, but any to be thinking about how they monetize their stack. And so that's a big part of where I see the value proposition of what we're trying to achieve at Bees Partners.
Yeah, excellent. And yeah, I mean it's been a while since we last caught up, which I believe was at Bitcoin Vegas. But
Yeah.
lots happened. I mean, lots happened the past weeks. I think the obvious thing that comes to mind is kind of the initial scare around strategies BTC sales, and then actually
Mm-hmm.
coming out in the past weeks with some real BTC sales, right, to bring STRC back to par.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, STRC right now is trading up quite a lot, so it looks like that's achieving its desired effect. But yeah, just curious how you've observed the past weeks, the BTC sales and yeah, just broadly this transition.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people got freaked out, and it's always the way. Like you get this sort of the tourists who are not paying attention to anything, and they're like, "Oh my God, like I just saw this thing, like Saylor's going to sell $5 billion worth of Bitcoin," and like it's a filing, and when you file, you tend to just sort of plan to give yourself as much flexibility as possible, so you don't have to do another filing tomorrow. Right, so he's just done a very large filing, which just allows him to have the flexibility to either sell Bitcoin to buy back MSTR or buy back STRC, or harvest a tax loss, which, all of those things are extremely incrementally strong for a shareholder of MSTR. So I think people get really confused about all of this. They also think that Saylor's the only person buying in the market, and if Saylor wasn't there, I mean, Jason, I always forget his last name, off the All In pod. He's like,
Mhm.
oh well, if Saylor wasn't there, then Bitcoin, where would Bitcoin be?
The ultimate counter signal, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's like there's so much nonsense in the space that I think we sort of get the double whammy in the Bitcoin treasury space, because you've already got the people that want to FUD Bitcoin, and even less people that understand Bitcoin treasury companies. So you've got this sort of 10x effect on the Bitcoin treasury company of FUD, where you're getting MNAV decreasing, obviously, as they underperform Bitcoin, which makes perfect sense, because they're a leverage trade on Bitcoin. So we're just going through a period of pendulum swinging, right? We had the really overzealous when I think you and I first met, sort of time of, H100 trading at 25 times MNAV and Smarter Web Company trading at 50 times MNAV. Now you're back to like discounts to MNAV, which, again, makes no sense either. So we're sort of trying to find the equilibrium, but we always have these huge shifts in the other direction as the pendulum swings. I think it's just, Bitcoin on
Yeah.
drugs, basically, is the
Yeah,
Bitcoin
yeah, yeah.
Treasury.
That's new, not amplify Bitcoin, but Bitcoin on steroids or Bitcoin on drugs. I like the maybe this show won't be we'll get a rating otherwise, but yeah, but I mean, I think it's quite interesting, right? Because there was the amount of FUD around the initial sort of BTC sales was obviously huge, right? I mean, Bitcoin itself went down quite substantially, right? We were trading a bit below 60,000. And now the actual news is coming out, right? There's real Bitcoin being sold, but it seems like, the market is in effect inoculated, right? Which is kind of
Yeah,
what Saylor trying to do. And it's interesting when, you're in a bear market and kind of bad news doesn't really move the price down anymore. I guess similarly to when you're in a bull market and good news doesn't really move it up anymore.
it's indicative of the
What
bottom.
are your thoughts on the market right now? Are we was this the bottom? Have we already seen the bottom? What's your
Well, I think what you just highlighted is indicative of a bottom. Is when selling negative news no longer has an impact to the downside on the price, right? You had the cold card wallet situation. Bitcoin was trading at 64K at the time that everybody found out on Saturday. Now we're at 64K again. I think we dipped as low as 62.8 or something. Like, it was just absolutely zero impact. I think even when you had the recent tensions with Iran blow up, everything else got sold off except Bitcoin. And for me, it feels like, and I've talked about this on a couple of podcasts recently, where you had that dip below 60,000 and you had a huge clip of buying come in and move Bitcoin to cold wallets. And it wasn't Sailor and it wasn't the ETFs. And it was like 250,000 Bitcoin, which is $17 billion. Right? That's a huge clip for someone to just take out of the market. So I think what's happened is that's exhausted all sellers. So now you've just seen this gentle ratchet up since it was around end of June, right? That happened. We're now early August. We've been basically flatlining for 6 weeks around the 60K level, but slowly just ratcheting higher. And every time it dips to 61K on the back of Trump saying something about Iran or whatever it is, we're immediately back at 64K again. So I think it's looking very, very strong here. I really like the price action. I think it's very constructive for a bottom. So I would say we've bottomed, and I know not many people want to go on the record and say that because you then stand the risk of being proved horribly wrong. But from what I'm seeing, it looks like we've bottomed. We would need something really seismic now to take us down to 50K. And I think, and this is the other thing, it's like, we've come all this way, sentiments at all-time lows, but it feels very much like 2022, where you'd had Three Arrows, BlockFi, Celsius, and then of course FTX. And none of those things have happened. Okay, obviously cold cars happen now, but that's
and
affected
more
one
things
thousand.
might happen.
More things might happen. You're right. You're right. I mean, there seems to be a couple of Bitcoin companies that have had to freeze their services lately, which seems a little bit strange as well in light of everything that happened with cold cards. So yeah, I think though that we are through the worst of it, unless we, to your point, see something a bit more
Yeah, I
seismic
think
happen.
that's a good. I was very much in agreement with you there, right? And I think one other thing I always sort of say to people when they sort of ask me about this is like, well, we are at the kind of 200-week moving average, right? Which is sort of historically the thing for Bitcoin that it doesn't really break through. unless you kind of get a deleveraging event, right? Like a real deleveraging in size. Like 2022, we broke through that, right, with 3 Hours Capital and Celsius initially, and then again with FTX. So it would need something of that magnitude, right? And I think it's quite clear as well over the past weeks that it's not going to be strategy. That deleveraging is not going to come from there. So if we break through it, it has to come from something else or from somewhere else. But the longer time goes on, the least likely that, or the less likely that becomes, right? And I guess also as volatility is compressing or flatlining, then at some point Bitcoin always becomes more volatile. And if we get a spike in volatility, it means we have to either go down or go up, right? So yeah, that's kind of coded to happen at some point, or at least at volatility spike, right? Which direction it would be is I guess another one, which also brought me to this other chart that I saw from, I think BitPain tweeted that, which I thought was a nice one, because people usually look a lot at the the 200-week moving average for Bitcoin, right? As sort of this bottom, and kind of trying to understand, okay, how does Bitcoin behave? He tweeted this chart of the 200-week moving average of strategy, which is also quite interesting, MSTR. Which we're clearly below. We're also very much below that in the bear market in 2022, start of 2023. Yeah, but I guess the sort of that bear market was obviously a bit longer. Maybe this one is shorter, but yeah, we're clearly below the 200-week moving average on strategy. I believe it's somewhere around $140. But don't quote me on that. I don't have the exact graph in front of me, but I thought that was an interesting one too. So very much amplify Bitcoin, but that would also mean that there is some potentially some kind of bottom forming there as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the two are pretty correlated, but I would say that yeah, for me, I'm not a technical guy. I don't look at charts to try and assess where we're going to go. I leave that to the guys that like to do that. I don't. I think it's all a little bit contrived, but obviously, if there's enough people that believe it, then it perpetuates. But I think that's what's very interesting about this 4-year cycle narrative is, if you looked at the 4-year cycle, I think we were supposed to dip in November, right? We ended up dipping in October. So everybody got front run. And equally, if you then look at time to recover to new all-time highs, that would put us in October from when we dipped. And I would imagine that people are going to start front running that as well. And I think with the way that the price has been so constructive, we're very, very close to that happening. And I think the thing that would be most interesting is if that happens during August while everybody's still away and not particularly focused. I'm talking about more in the traditional financial markets where you see sort of quiet times generally.
We're clearly very focused, the two of us,
Yeah,
at least here.
yeah, exactly.
So,
I think Bitcoiners generally will always be focused, but now that you've got institutional capital coming in, it will be very interesting to see what happens if we start to run in August and they all come back to their desks in September and they're having to chase it. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. And speaking of that, speaking of institutions, I mean, just before we went live, we're just chatting about a few things that happened the past weeks. Of course, you already mentioned cold card. Something that we is probably also important to chat about. Obviously very crazy almost what happened there, right? So well, for those of you who are not familiar, cold card obviously being a hardware wallet provider where you can cold store Bitcoin, but there was a bug or error in the system that generated the seed phrases, which essentially means that that they weren't as random as they should be, which made it easy to brute force them. And a hacker essentially brute forced a lot of seed phrases of people's cold cards that were in a vault in cold storage, and people thought that Bitcoin was very safe, and all of a sudden it was on the move. I believe over 1,000 Bitcoin this way was stolen. Of course, very much hope that comes back and is still evolving. But but yeah, you had some thoughts of like how institutions would see this, and
Not
how.
institutions. I think
Mhm,
individuals,
mhm,
right? Like the question is now being asked: do you want to have 100% of your wealth in cold storage when you're not a tech guy? You don't know how to, proofread the random number generation tech or lines of code. Um, you've got you you've got the option to do multi-sig, which is another level of complication. You've got an option to do dice rolls, which has been debated heavily over the last few days, which again is not something that I think the majority of people are going to do. So I think it will mean that people will lean much more towards what I've been saying for a while now, where you think of your Bitcoin as capital. And so your Bitcoin cash allocation is in your cold storage. And I think obviously for all the reasons we know about Bitcoin, your cash allocation is going to be bigger than it would be in a normal fiat portfolio. So you might have anything up to 70 or 8% in cold. But I think that more and more people are going to be open to the idea of going, okay, I want diversification within my custody setup. I want a fund like we're focused on at Bees Partners. I want a Bitcoin Treasury allocation, right? Because these are different custodian allocations that can actually end up getting you more Bitcoin on your stack over time. So I think it just leads more towards the Bitcoin as your capital as a Bitcoiner sort of focus. And I'm sure you do too, but I speak to a lot of family offices that hold Bitcoin on the balance sheet,
mhm.
and I think
It's very
this
interesting.
conversation is going
You
to
mentioned
change
this, so you're sort of saying
things.
that cold storage Bitcoin would be, like, think of it kind of like cash under a mattress type of thing, whereas Bitcoin exposure is something that people will think of like very differently, in terms of just like how many units of Bitcoin, but more like how many units of exposure do I have to different Bitcoin companies, Bitcoin treasury companies, stuff like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that if you're a fiat-minded allocator of capital, then you're thinking about the various different buckets. Is it private equity? Is it private credit? Is it hedge funds? Is it, other things like equities, bonds that you're allocating to, or even gold and Bitcoin? When it comes to Bitcoin, you're thinking about, I want Bitcoin exposure. I only want Bitcoin exposure, but I can take different risk weightings within that Bitcoin exposure bucket. I think your analogy about cash under the mattress with Bitcoin, that's exactly right for cold storage. And your allocation is going to be bigger than a cash allocation normally in a fiat portfolio. Then you can go and say, okay, I want a little bit more spice in my portfolio. I want to have the opportunity to make some yield on my Bitcoin. And then you'd allocate in a more volatile way to the Bitcoin treasuries, in a less volatile way to something like what we do at Bees. And that's the way that you end up. I can imagine people will end up thinking and be pushed a little bit more by this cold card situation, because even if you've got a Trezor set up, or Ledger or Jade or anything like this, where obviously the code, it seems to be fairly solid, you're going to have doubt in your mind, right? You're going to be like, well, hang on, is it a good idea to have 100% of my wealth in Bitcoin, held in some sort of technology that I don't properly understand? And I think it's really shone a light on this don't trust, verify mantra, where a lot of the Bitcoiners that people trusted were saying cold card was the solution. It was the right solution. So it's very sad, but I do think that it's going to end up to just greater financialization of Bitcoin.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, I think fair, a very very fair take, and yeah, we'll be interested to see how it develops. Of course, it's um, yeah, like obviously hard to see people really moving away from self custody, but I think, yeah, and from a self custody perspective, the solution is probably to, well, use multiple hardware wallets in a multi-sig or a setup at least that is more robust. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's not for everyone, and especially
Mm.
as more people enter the ecosystem, family offices and so on.
But the
But yeah, it's a
question,
different question.
the question to you is like, I'm sure you orange pill people all the time, and you're getting people to buy Bitcoin. How comfortable do you feel now telling an individual, well, you should buy a Trezor and store it on
Mm.
that hardware wallet? I mean,
It really
this is
depends on how sophisticated they are. If they're very, very sophisticated and they're very technical and they're, software engineer and stuff like that, then, it's obviously different what you would say to someone who's
yeah.
maybe older, who I would maybe say is, okay, look, find a couple providers, spread it out, and do something like that, right? Rather than,
But can you imagine if you've been
yeah.
telling people to use Cold Card? I mean, it's just
Mhm.
awful, just absolutely awful.
Yeah, so we're almost at the 21 minutes. Maybe we should um, end on a high note. But
Yes, good. Let's do that.
I'm trying to think what we can do. It's
Well, look, I think there is a high note. That is that we've most likely bottomed. I think that somewhere between now and October, we're going to go very hard again. I think it's very encouraging to see that gold and silver have started to run in the last 24 hours. I think that's actually going to be the trigger that starts to drag Bitcoin higher because, you talk about capital allocation, capital rotation. Like if you've been sitting in all these trades and you've watched your AI portfolio come off drastically post the recent sell-off that we've seen, then once you see that gold run, you're going to be thinking much more carefully about rotation. And I think Bitcoin really hasn't run at all this year. And while everything else has been quite nicely up occasionally to the upside, and I think that will encourage people a lot more to push into Bitcoin quicker.
Yeah, I know. I wholeheartedly agree. But yeah, with that, let's round it up. It's great to chat. I hope you have a great summer. You just stay on a couple seconds so we can finish the upload. But yeah, it
Great.
was a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thanks, Tycho.
All right, guys, talk soon.
Cheers.